Professor Pang? Hi. So we're all seated over here. It's a little bit awkward, but I hope this is okay. Okay. So we have a translator for Professor Chung. 이재혁 선생님이신가요? 예. So in the audience, if you'd like to ask a question in Korean, you're welcome to. Mr. Lee will translate the question into English and also translate back Professor Chun's answer in English. Okay, so any students or participants joining us online, you are welcome to raise a question in either languages. I'm sure that we'll be flooded with questions today, so we could just open up the floor and also online participants and receive questions, or I can just have a few questions ready to just open up the discussion. So if you can raise your hand if you have a question. If not, I'll ask the participants and presenters a few questions just to open up the discussion. 여기 혹시 질문 있으신 분? 김정환 선생님? So we already have a question from Professor Kim Jung-hwan. So I'll just leave my questions for later when there aren't any questions raised. Professor.
네, 들리세요? Thank you for a great presentations. I have one small question and one big question. One small question is for Professor Pang, the first presenter. Thank you for your presentation. I'm very struck by the ways in which you argue how Ho's political action is driven by her fandom, which is basically revolving around affect, fantasy, and drive, and libido, and how her political action works on the tensions or dynamics between high and low forces, between willfulness and, let's say, unconscious, right? So my question is on the freedom that you mentioned. Ho finds in her prison writing and her political action, and what kind of freedom you see in particular in her writing and action, and how that freedom taps into the public affective bond. That's the question. And I have a big question for all of the presenters. I think in this conference, we've been thinking about together how we might revisit the interesting concept of Korea. It can be an object of study, and it can be like ontological condition or epistemological position, or say like a condition for transnational methodologies, like for thinking about like different possibilities. So I think Korea is very interesting and special, not just because we have BTS and Bong Joon-ho, but because Korea embodies like all the crises and possibilities and contradictions of our present moment. So I was wondering how is presenter, your take on the interesting object of Korea and how we might revisit and think together how its particularity resonate with the universal.
Thank you for the question. So shall we start with the small question and move on to the larger question? 아까 선생님 첫 번째 질문이 팽 선생님이시죠? So Professor Pang, would you like to answer Professor Kim's first question?
Sure. This is by no means a small question. This is a huge question, but I can try to answer it very quickly. I think what I'm trying to do is a very counterintuitive reading. I'm not trying to romanticize Gwyneth Ho. I think this is very important to remember that she is in prison, and she actually lost her freedom. But what I'm trying to struggle, and I think with her primarily, is how she could still maintain a form of agency, as I tried to mention in the beginning of the paper, or try a sense of control, and in that sense, a sense of freedom to be herself and to continue her political project. I mean, obviously, it's not possible. She is now in prison and she is deprived of her political agency in that sense. But what we see in her is her struggle of coming to terms with her positions while continuing to be herself. So I think that is the project that really is a project that really strikes me. And I think it also resonates with a lot of people, not just specifically in the political positions of being imprisoned or behind bars. But I think to many of us who feel vulnerable or who feel impossible to do things as we hope. There's a certain idealism we have, and then the reality seems to be much more dimmer and bleaker. And there's so many things that we can no longer be the one that we want to be. So it's this kind of individual struggles and how she continues to assert herself, and particularly her very complicated personal longing and desire and lust, how she can continue to articulate these things in her own personal way, at the same time resonate with a lot of people, while at the same time respond to a political position in many different ways, which I find moving, and that's pretty much what I can only do.
Thank you, Professor Pan. Since you have the microphone, would you like to answer the second question as well, or have some time and wait?
Koreanness?
We have the larger question for the entire panel, so if you would like to just continue and answer, or
okay. I think this is
we'll give you some time. Okay, so
I think it's more so for the Korean scholars. So I
Professor
to hear from
okay,
you guys.
thank you, Professor MOBRAND and Professor Cho and Professor Chung.
I think your question also contained the answer, and my response is yes. I think two different answers you gave are spot on as ways to approach this. One is is locating Korea transnationally and studying it in the context of those transnational networks. One way of going about that I'm a little bit familiar with is the Inter-Asia project, and I think that's highly promising. I think Korea has remained a bit on the margins of that effort. Maybe for some reason, I think that the Inter-Asia project is more attractive in places that had different colonial experiences and that have maybe less nationalism or patriotism today, and that may be part of the reluctance. But I think there's still some promise in placing Korea in those regional or other global transnational contexts. And then, just as you said, trying to find the universal in the particular while acknowledging the importance of context and how we get various twists on global themes. And for me, looking at something like democracy, that's the stuff to bring out. And I think, as I said, it's really, really tough. Academically, it's tough. I talk a bit with journalist types and public commentators who may be better placed to do this work. And what we talk about is how do we build metaphors that capture something going on in Korea and that work for foreign audiences, different foreign audiences. And I think there's a lot of work to be done there and coming up with metaphors that are going to speak to other people.
Thank you, Professor Cho.
Yeah, it is a huge question, but I think a very worthy one for those of us who identify in some way as, people who engage in Korean studies. Even though I think a lot of, so from the context that I come from in North America, people will study Korea as an area, but then they do it from the confines of a certain disciplinary perspective. And so then Korea turns into like the case study or something. And I think that relationship is shifting quite a bit, and the relationship between kind of disciplinary tools of analysis versus the case, which is the site and the specific, phenomenon, that is shifting quite a bit. And especially in media studies, I think there's a push to really see what the objects, how they theorize themselves, right? So it's not really about the split between theory object or, analytical tool or heuristic and the specific, context or event. So moving in the other direction, I think, is really important. I also wanted to say, though, that I think that, the question of Korea's exemplarity, whether or not that's something that, is only recently articulated with the kind of dilemmas of the post-candlelight movement situation, in which it seems as capitalist realism, the conditions of capitalist realism are inevitable. So, the question of whether its exemplarity is a recent thing or whether we can trace it, further back, I think is also a really important one for those of us who are undertaking this kind of work, because I think there can be, a real trap of presentism and, not realizing that, like I was recently looking at, Jameson's visit and discussion about the Korean context in the late 1980s. And, he was already talking about Korea's exemplarity and the way that it brought together a kind of convergence of different political, economic, and cultural axes that made it so absolutely crucial for people to be looking at the relationship that Korea has with U.S. empire and U.S. hegemony. In a post-American century and the ostensible rise of an Asian one, where does South Korea fit because of its close relationship to American hegemony, So, these are the kinds of questions that I think are helpful to be asking in this moment, taking seriously this idea that, South Korea has emerged as this place that exemplifies, the conditions that seem to be set a lot of post-industrial societies, but at the same time, thinking about that in much more rigorously historicized terms.
Thank you so much. 청 교수님.
네, 제가 발표문에 조금 언급했지만 말씀 못 드렸던 부분들을 말씀드리면 될 것 같은데요. 질문의 의도가 정확하게 뭔지는 잘 모르겠지만 어쨌든 보편성과 특수성에 대해 질문하신 것 같은데요. 저는 이제 보편성은 잘 모르겠지만 한류를 가지고 이야기해 보면 그 한류는 2020년에서 2022년 사이에 어떤 특이점이 왔죠. 그 특이점은 한국 한류 K-팝이든 K-드라마든 K-서사든 간에 이제 이것이 미국에 의해서 크게 인정받고 미국의 대자본이 여기 투자를 하게 되고 또 그럼으로써 전 세계의 관객들이 여기 이제 보게 되는 과정이었다고 생각합니다. 이 통역을 그냥
So if I mention about the universality of Korean studies, and especially about the Korean culture aspect. So ever since from 2020 to 2020, there has been a significant turning point in K-culture. So it's at the fact that the K-culture content has been, the popularity of K-content has been driven by the power of U.S., not only in terms of a cultural influence, but also by the capitals, for example, Netflix. So through the influence of the U.S., it has been universalized and gained more popularity throughout the world.
네, 봉준호 감독이 기생충으로 아카데미상을 수상하면서 여러 영화제에서 그 수상 소감을 말했는데 그 중에 이제 기억나는 장면이 두 가지가 있습니다. 하나는 뭐냐면 그 LA 비평가 협회에서 준 상을 받고 난 뒤에 말하기를 이제 봉준호 감독은 저와 같은 또래인데요. 그 자기 영화 예술의 원천에 대해서 이야기하면서 그 소년 시절에 AFKN, 그 아메리칸 Forces Korean Network인가요? 그 AFK 아마 젊은 분들은 잘 모르실 수도 있는데 그야말로 식민주의적인 어떤 방송 네트워크의 전형적인 상징이라 할 수 있는 한국의 채널이 5개도 안 된 상황에서 제일 좋은 채널 2번을 딱 차지하고 거기서 이제 미군과 미국 가족들이 보는 드라마, 영화 그리고 이제 음악 방송들을 틀어주는 거죠. 이제 그걸 보면서 미국의 영화 대가들의 뭐 브라이언 드 팔마, 존 카펜터, 스콜세지 이런 영화를 보면서 자기가 이제 영화적으로 성장했다 이런 이야기를 한 게 흥미로웠습니다. 왜냐하면 그게 한국적인 건 거죠. 왜냐하면 한국은 해방 이후에 굉장히 깊이 태평양 문화체제, 미국과 일본 중심의 냉전 태평양 문화체제에 개입됨으로써 글로벌한 것들을 배우고 또 거기 따라가고 하는 상황이기 때문에요.
So if I mention an anecdote from director Bong Joon-ho, so he mentioned his story from the LA Critics Association. So he grew up during his childhood watching AFKN, which is a channel, American channel for American forces in Korea. And the channel itself has been really American-centric, delivering all the American content to a wider audience. Watching that and growing up, Director Bong has become very Koreanized, but by watching the U.S. contents through his childhood as well. So in terms of the dynamics during the Cold War era, having a wide influx of U.S. contents in Korea, the very American content has become the very Korean content in nowadays.
네, 그래서 그 말 한마디에서 볼 수 있는 것과 그다음에 이제 봉준호 감독이 말했던 것 중에서 아카데미 영화제는 로컬 영화제 아닙니까? 이렇게 이제 받아쳤던 장면이 떠오르는데 이제 실제로 아카데미 영화제를 로컬 영화제라기보다도 그 미국 사람들이 아카데미 영화제를 생각하는 방식에 대해서 이야기한 것이 저는 이제 이 한국과 미국 문화의 관계에 대한 뭔가 이렇게 재조정된 다른 파트너인 거죠. 그러니까 여전히 종속적이거나 여전히 비균등하거나 하지만 어쨌든 다른 파트너로 기입되는 장면을 이야기한 것이라 생각되는데요. 그러니까 한국에 있어서의 글로벌리티란 바로 이런 것이라고 생각합니다. 그러니까 굉장히 개방적이고 동시에 미국적임으로써 내지는 영어 중심적임으로써 글로벌리티를 갖게 되는 그런 상황이죠. 한국에는 200만에 가까운 외국인이 살고 있고요. 그 가운데서 반 이상은 중국과 아시아인들인데 그들은 한국 사회 저층을 구성하고 있습니다. 노동자들의 대부분을 구성하고 있는데 그 사람들의 이야기들은 잘 가시화되지 않습니다. 그러니까 한국의 글로벌리티 가지고 있는 뭐랄까 계급성이랄까요? 그 안에 들어있는 굉장히 뭐랄까 이걸 뭐라 표현할지 모르겠지만 어떤 위계를 가지고 있는 글로벌리티이고 한국의 상층 계급은 제가 이제 일관되게 오늘 발표에서 이야기하고 싶었던 것이 좀 많죠. 예. 그래서 그 한국의 상층 계급이 가지고 있는 글로벌한 에너지 또 능력 그 지향성 같은 것이 갖고 있는 그 거대함과 그 에너지를 누가 그걸 막고 누가 그걸 어떻게 조정할 건지 사실 잘 모르겠거든요. 일단
So also Director Bong mentioned that the Academy Award is sort of a local event, but it's a sort of a sarcasm. But I think it throws a point of thinking by revising the partnership of U.S.-Korea relationship, at least in terms of a cultural aspect. So in Korea, we used to define what is global is to be rather quite American or quite US-like. And speaking of the fact that we have 2 million people living in Korea nowadays, most of them are from an Asian regions, including China or Japan, but we don't really perceive them as in global aspect. We don't really conceive them as being part of a globalization. And in that terms, we have a sort of an social hierarchy or the caste system, I would say, that has the upper class has an sort of an hegemonic power to define what is being global or what is being internationalized.
예, 선생님 질문을 이제 마무리를 하셔야 될 것
네,
같아요. 질문에 대한 답을.
한마디 먼저 말씀. 네, 그래서 그 기생충과 오징어 게임이 글로벌한 인기를 끌었을 때도 마찬가지였는데 한류의 작동 방식이 그거라고 생각하는데요. 그 두 드라마에는 굉장히 날카로운 계급 대립에 대한 이야기가 들어있지 않습니까? 굉장히 불편한 서사라고 처음에는 이야기 되었죠. 왜냐하면 빈자의 냄새를 부자가 못 견뎌하고 그런 못 견뎌하는 부자를 이제 낫인가요? 도끼로 살해한다 이런 마치 1920, 30년대 개건문학에서 나오는 그런 서사 같은 것이었는데 불구하고 그런 서사의 내용들은 다 이렇게 지워지고 엄청나게 국제적으로 인정을 받았다는 것만 남게 되었죠. 그러니까 무슨 말인고 하니 이 한류는 원래 그 두 가지 방향으로 항상 움직여 왔는데 하나는 그 한국 민족주의, 한국 문화적 민족주의, 우리가 잘났다, 우리가 세계 최고다는 국뽕을 강화하는 방향으로 항상 움직이고요. 그 방향과 함께 동시에 더 글로벌화되는 의지 같은 것이 동시에 존재하는 것 같습니다. 이게 이제 보편과 특수라고 말할 수 있을지 모르겠지만 어쨌든 한국에서 글로벌리티가 움직이는 방식이 아닌가고 생각합니다.
So, in terms of the mechanism of Hallyu, I think we can see that well from the case of Parasite and Squid Game. In that context, we can see the critical narration of social hierarchy in Korea, but instead we only mention about the success of that content itself in international market. So I think there is a duality in the universality in Korean studies. So there's a highly centric nationalismic aspect, while at the same time we have a strong desire of globalization.
Thank you. Professor Pang, sorry for keeping you waiting. Would you like to also answer this question, or shall we just skip over to the next question? It's up to you.
I think I can very briefly comment on the fact that I am not Korean studies, but in the case of the Korean cultural wave that it's felt globally could also be considered as as I said, as a wave. So the definition of a wave is that it comes and goes. So I think that has happened in history, particularly in terms of popular culture, that this kind of trend will subside eventually. So I think maybe we have to understand the nature of popular culture as made up of trends and waves, instead of it's meant to be fleeting, and it's meant to be temporally defined. So that's what I can only comment on.
Thank you.
On this.
Thank you. Yes, I saw you, Dean Lee. Erik just pointed out that.
Yes, I'm Suk-jae Lee and faculty here in philosophy. I want to thank everybody for their wonderful talk. My question is directed at Professor Pang and Professor Cho, and the kinds of new sort of political activism that you're describing is really fascinating, because it shows a kind of new form of agency, as I think you well point out. And my question is that given that the forms themselves are very whimsical, and it seems as though they're fleeting, and the media that they use is very different, and it's mixed up with very non-traditional ways of expressing various political views, I'm wondering whether how lasting these forms will be, whether they'll take on a sort of a new legitimacy and become more widespread and pervasive, or, as you just pointed out in your last comment, is this just a wave as well, and will this subside? So, thank you.
So obviously, again, thank you so much, every one of you, for such fascinating, very thoughtful and thought-provoking presentations. I have a lot of questions and comments, but as a follow-up question to Professor Lee's, I was wondering, Professor Cho, if you can say something about this notion of sort of subject formation of these fans, forming themselves into a political agent, but then without even mentioning of Foucault, there has to be a sort of concomitant process of, in some ways, of subjectification, right? I mean, that's the whole thesis of Foucault and modern subject formation. So I'm just playing a devil's advocate here, because I am obviously very sympathetic to your thesis, but at the same time, I'm wondering what you see as these sort of what we might call subjectification process, for the lack of better words. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. So thank you for these questions. I mean, they're crucial and important in any kind of assessment or attempt to assess what is happening with these kind of outpourings or the movement of K-pop fans into spaces that would not customarily include them. And so I don't want to suggest that this is all good. I don't know if that ambivalence came through in the presentation, but I think that the subjectivation process, Professor Lee, that you're asking about, or the kind of, Codian sort of capture that is happening is basically a further entrenchment of individuals into a platform economy and a way of thinking about the self that is always a content type of self. So the idea that you are a person, but a person is content or contents. And that is basically the logic of self-commodification that that social media platforms, as well as I think other arenas, have basically made inevitable in certain ways. And I don't know how there is a way back from that or an alternative to that. So I think what I am interested in trying to bring forth is that within those constraints, there is self-reflexivity, there's some critique, and there's some attempt to try to, it's an aporia, right? As you're using the platform to mobilize and organize, you are also reinforcing the power of the platform, right? So there's this kind of dilemma here. But within that, I think there are things that are happening that are worth paying attention to. I think that's the very kind of modest point that I wanted to make. But I also wanted to raise, so what I wanted to raise attention to is the fact that, we are in a media environment in which media events, if I can call something like being the #1 trending hashtag on Twitter a sort of, event, because now apparently it is. These kinds of media events are amplified and transformed into social facts by the news media that has come to have a pretty dependent relationship on the tracking mechanisms of these platforms. I was really surprised to find how much this argument about K-pop fans' political agency was a set of feedback loops. Like, there was so little actual reporting that interviewed fans or found, real people to talk to, although there was some. But even that kind of reporting cannot serve as evidence for the kind of large claim that's being made, because fandom is not, fandom is like the nation, right? Fandom is like not an entity that you can all gather in one room. It is as much an imagined community as the nation has been theorized to be. So in that case, much of the news about popular culture today, youth culture, is rumor. And so that was another point that I thought was worth at least acknowledging. And I'm not trying to make a moralizing claim about rumor. I think so much of what goes as political opinion today, public opinion, is rumor. But I think we should take it into account and think about it and what the implications of that fact is. And, I think that will help us to perhaps be more critical about what politics today can be and can look like. And so to answer the question about, whether or not this is a trend, how lasting will these forms be? Is this going to be as will this last, or is this too a trend? I guess I want to distinguish between this idea that, certain pop cultural contents are trends, because I think that's true. And so, when Professor Pang is talking about the Korean wave as a trend in other places, I think that's totally right. But the response to the content is, I think, structured somewhat differently, and it has a little bit more, it's stickier, I think, because it again relies on technological infrastructures and then the subjectivation processes that we were talking about just now. So will this kind of online politics last further? I think absolutely. I mean, I think that it is the primary way in which people access something like the social totality in today, what they imagine as a social totality, and imagine their relationship to it. And so, I don't see that changing as long as, individuals are primarily accessing the information about the world that they live in and making sense of it through these kinds of digitally mediated platform spaces. Yeah.
Professor Pang, would you like to answer as well?
I want to concur with what Michelle just mentioned about certain things that stick, particularly in terms of the mediated online cyber experiences. But at the same time, we also need to recognize, for example, the form itself, like K-pop itself, it's a cultural form, and then we know that K-pop actually had were strongly influenced by American culture. I mean, it's very clear that the American presence in the K-pop culture was so strong to the extent that it actually facilitated it to go global. So, according to my understanding, is that we should not fetishize, the Koreanness in the K-pop culture, but to understand the K-pop culture itself is already a hybrid of many forms of popular content already there. So there is this kind of fluidity in the popular culture facilitated by the online media among different people, able to use the technology to create a global fandom. Is you can say it's very new, but at the same time, we can also understand it as some sort of like globalizing kind of like result. And so the fact that, let's say in Hong Kong, the fact that now people here feel that there is a new local culture coming up that can supersede the K-pop trend that's dominating Hong Kong young people for a while, can also be very liberating. The fact that there's a local culture redeveloping in a very politically depressed atmosphere against the dominations of K-pop and other popular culture. So it's that kind of fluidity and also responsiveness to the actual happenings in the particular society that matters more so than the content itself. I think that's a bit. I don't know whether this is a bit offensive to a lot of fans, but if we want to understand the structural kind of emotional structure or how the popular culture can become politicized or gain political weight, we really need to bring the political context into the discussion instead of just looking at the content itself.
Thank you. Professor Yu, and then Professor Yi.
Thank you for wonderful presentations. I have a question for Professor MOBRAND. So in the dualism between cynicism and optimism, I'm wondering where we can place pessimism. And pessimism, whether you see possibility for kind of a pessimistic critique that I think was really exemplified by Professor Chun's presentation, actually, that is not immediately in the capture of the cynical mode, either by the left or by the appropriation of the right. So can we have a space for pessimism that is not, in other words, that devolves into cynicism?
Professor Yi has a follow-up question, right?
Yes.
I actually wanted to tag along and have another question for them, but
So sorry, I seem to be having follow-up questions this morning. But I was very inspired by actually Professor MOBRAND's notion of the humanities task as storytelling and recrafting the narrative, especially at this moment of political retreat. And so I'm wondering, again, and I think this would have to be sort of in conversation with Professor Jung-hwan's response to the question that Professor Ryu raised for Professor MOBRAND. And so I'm again talking about this sort of political imaginaries that could be mobilized, even at times of retreat, even in times of what Professor Ryu called pessimism. And so, again, so the same question for Professor Chun. I don't know, did I make myself clear?
okay, so Professor MOBRAND and then Professor Chun.
Yeah, I think fair point. I can add the pessimistic critique, and we have a clear articulation of it at the table. I think that critique was, or that story was not there so much 5, 6, 7 years ago, and that story has come out clearer. One could include it. Jung-hwan has made itself irrelevant, so I didn't really include it because they have, I think, among electoral forces, become the ones somewhat associated with that position, or at least former followers of that. There are stories there about we had certain individuals around there fall away, and I think that changed the tone on that side as well. Yeah, I think it's a good point. There is a pessimistic critique. I like to end optimistically. Maybe that's just my personality, but I think there really is. One can find grounds for being hopeful and doing things that make change. And I think that is something that resonates actually with a lot of Koreans today as well. Maybe I'll let Professor Chun respond before adding anything else.
네, 그럴 수 있겠네요. 제가 발표한 내용이 이제 낙관주의적인 내용은 아니었다고 보여지는데요. 그런데 이제 대중이라든지 또 권력 의지가 있는 정치 집단 같은 경우에는 냉소나 낙관 또 패시미즘 이런 틀로 해석되기 어렵다고 생각합니다. 그러니까 대중은 대중의 삶에 근거해서 언제든지 자기 능력과 역능을 발휘할 거고요. 또 권력 의지가 있는 집단은 또 나름의 논리와 나름의 걸 발명해내겠죠. 다만 현재의 한국 정치적 상황, 문화적 상황이라는 것이 갖고 있는 게 이제 아까 말씀하신 것처럼 이제 정의당도 이제 한 사례가 될 수 있겠는데. 다른 틀과 다른 문화와 다른 헤게모니의 기제가 필요한 거죠. 그렇고 이제 마지막으로 말하면 이거 유명한 말 있지 않습니까? 이제 한국 역사가 그래왔지만 이성으로 비관하고 의지로 낙관하라. 이런 말을 들을 수 있을 것 같고 그 경험의 수준에서 윤석열 정부가 어떻게 될지 모르겠지만 한국의 대중이 가지고 있는 분노나 에너지 같은 것이 이제 어떤 방법으로 어떤 촛불과 같은 2010년대의 방식이 아닌 다른 방식으로 어떤 무엇과 만나느냐에 따라서 달라질 거라고 생각합니다.
천 선생님 마이크 꺼주셔야지 잘 들린다고 하시네요 온라인에.
Okay, so my presentation might not be seen quite optimistic, and I agree with that. But I personally believe that the Korean political aspect cannot be defined categorically based on like cynicism or optimism or even pessimism clearly. So the dynamics of Korean politics or Korean culture is based on people's lives. And based on that motion, the group of power for will make their own logic based on that lives. And in terms of the political cultural circumstances, there's going to be always a new logic comes up in order to survive, in order to enhance. So, and there's a famous phrase that criticize with the reason and optimize with the will. So I don't know how this new administration will be in the future, but I'm sure there's going to be a new aspect coming up based on certain aspects coming up.
Okay, thank you. I have a question from Professor Kim Hyun-sub, one of the presenters yesterday. I think this is addressed to Professor MOBRAND. It's kind of long, but I think it's a very important question, so I'll just read it if I can find it. Hold on. 직접 말씀하시라고 할까요? 김현서 선생님 지금 켜 계신가요? 비디오?
예.
예, 잘 됐네요. 너무 질문이 길어서 제가 선생님 직접 좀 질문을 해주시면 감사하겠습니다. 예.
So I have two questions, mainly for Erik MOBRAND. One conceptual, the other methodological. So I wonder what you mean by democracy. So you're saying that Koreans are divided into two groups, whom you call cynics, are merely pretending to be Democrats, but they are really undermining it, and optimists are genuinely trying to realize it. But as you know, there are so many models or conceptions of democracy, like minimalist, representative, participatory, deliberative, etc. So who are genuine Democrats and who are mere pretenders or giving democracy a bad name will depend on what kind of democracy you have in mind. I'm inclined to think that different people have different ideas about democracy, not only in Korea, but in many other countries around the world. So I'm asking what conception of democracy you're using in your talk, and I'm wondering whether you're doing justice to the apparently various conceptions of democracy Koreans have. And the other is methodological. So I wonder what kind of evidence we should seek to, in support of your view on Korean democracy. So, for example, how can you verify that cynicism is a political strategy of anti-democratic people in Korea? In particular, I'd like to know whether and how we scholars can make sure that we are not merely reproducing just so stories. So I agree with you that narratives matter. So I think we should be cautious. Our theories are not simply reinforcing the conventional narrative. Thank you.
Shall I respond? Yeah, thanks for those questions. Absolutely, I am not doing justice to the various definitions of democracy, but neither am I trying to. At first, I simply want to note that there is a difference between an objective understanding of democracy as a system of rule, which is fine to have, and a subjective one, and that it's important to acknowledge subjective understandings of democracy because they are focal points for communication and coordination. And there's a lot of them out there, for sure. So I vastly oversimplified, but I tried to pick out two strands that I think are relevant today and that have relatively deep histories. And as I reflected more on Professor Ryu's question, actually, I think pessimism is not a distinct strand of democratic thinking. I think it is an attitude among a particular group in Korean society today, but I do not think it is based on a particular understanding of democracy. This is where I am after a few minutes of thinking about your question. On the methodological question, what is the evidence? Well, this was just a talk, so I didn't really present evidence. I put that in my papers, but the main method is simply empathy, and I think that is a humanistic approach. We need to empathize with the people we are studying, understand the symbols that they are deploying to express something, and think about how those symbols and those demands relate to the material circumstances that they are in. The rest goes in papers.
김엽 선생님 답이 되셨나요?
예, 감사합니다.
예. 감사합니다. 예, 다른 분들이 질문하시 저도 재빨리 하나만 질문을 정말 드리고 싶은 게 있는데 So I have one question for everyone, and I was thinking about this when Professor Cho was talking, and also when Professor Kim was asking the question, and also Professor Isokje and also Inami. So it's a very simple question, and when Professor Chan was talking, K 자본, that really struck me as a very important concept. And my question is, can K culture or K-pop elude or overcome K capital? And I think this circles back to all of the questions that we're raising about, neoliberal capitalist system being the basis of, and this is what Professor Cho was talking about, and also Professor Yu talking about the pessimism of it. And it was my impression that Professor Chan, the domestic scholar, was much more pessimistic in the way that we conceptualize K culture vis-a-vis, K capital, compared to international scholars, and Professor Cho mentioned that, this is how it's received from the US, right? So any one of you, if you can answer that question?
I think that's a question that a lot of people are asking, actually. Can maybe in a different form, like why is it the case that South Korean culture, especially in the way that it has been marketed and received in the kind of huge hits that we have heard about here, Squid Game and Parasite, why are those cultural texts able to produce some of the most kind of scathing critiques of capitalism that resonate most broadly across different places and cultural contexts when they are coming from a place in which, the suffering caused by capitalism seems to be both tolerated in a way that's kind of surprising, and the structures seem intractable. So what do we do with that relationship? And I don't know, I would love to hear more from others because it's definitely a question that I have mulled over a lot. The question of whether, K culture is represented, for example, in the kind of solidarities that you find among K-pop fans or other groups that come together around collective causes that we can somehow attribute to being influenced by Korean popular culture. I think that there's an attempt always in those kind of collective spaces to hold on to this idea of collective feeling trumping individual interest. And, that obviously can be channeled towards serving the profit motives of the Korean entertainment companies, as it often is. But nonetheless, you see so much within the fandom of a kind of a gift economy, practices of relating that are an attempt, at least I think, to resist the alienation that, is so pervasive in capitalist societies. And so I don't think that K culture can overcome K capitalism, but I think fan culture is an interesting space to watch to see where resistance can be found.
Thank you so much. 천 교수님 답해 주실 수 있으실까요?
네, 좀 어려운 문제인데요. 이제 팬덤의 행동주의에 대해 제가 세세하게 잘 몰라서 조심스럽지만 작년 하반기인가 최근에 이제 그분도 생각해 보니까 우리 서울대 인문대 출신인데 어떤 젊은 논객이 K-팝 팬들의 세계적인 이 행동주의와 민주주의적 잠재성에 대해서 이야기하면서 K-팝 팬들이 중국 공산당과 이슬람 세계의 그 독재와 그 억압을 부수고 세계 혁명에 마치 이제 무슨 어떤 이 세력이 주력군이 될 것처럼 이제 그런 글을 쓴 적이 있더라고요. 그래서 뭐 왜 그렇게 썼는지 이해가 되기도 하고 또 그 자체로 의미도 있겠지만 모르겠습니다. 그러니까 그 나라마다 맥락이 있을 거고 또 대륙마다 또 문화권마다 다 서로 다른 맥락이 있을 건데 그 맥락들을 세세하게 들여다보고 또 케이팝 팬들이 가지고 있는 그 팬으로서의 행동주의 같은 게 독특한 행동주의 같은 게 있잖아요. 그게 일반 민주주의의 공론장과 뭐 촛불 같은 데서의 행동주의라는 것과 어디가 갖고 다른가를 잘 준비해서 이야기해야 되지 않나 그런 생각만 가지고 있습니다.
선생님 근데 그 아까 K 자본이라고 하셨을 때 제가 궁금했던 게 이제 그 글로벌한 게 사실은 K 자본도 아니고 미국의 자본이라고 하셨잖아요. 그럼 그렇게 볼 때는 이게 사실은 어떤 아까 글로벌리즘 얘기하실 때는 그게 사실 보편성은 아닌 것 같고 선생님이 지적하신 거는 보편성이 못 미치는 어떤 더 사실 걱정스러운 무엇인가가 있다라고 지적하신 것 같은데 조금 더 구체적으로 말씀해 주실 수 있나요?
그렇죠. 이제 이를테면 그 오징어 게임이 어떻게 세계적인 콘텐츠로 번져갔는가 이걸 생각해 본 적이 있었는데요. 처음에 아시아권의 가난한 나라들에서 오징어 게임이 매우 인기를 끄는 광경을 발견할 수가 있었습니다. 근데 그랬다가 이제 어느 날 이제 미국에서도 미국에서 가장 많이 본 콘텐츠가 되면서 갑자기 이제 그 맥락이 달라지기 시작한 걸 봤는데요. 그 두 가지가 다 있겠죠. 그러니까 그 빈자들이 처한 보편적인 현실 같은 것과 또 거기에 틈입해 들어오는 자본의 힘이나 미국화의 힘 같은 것들이 경합하고 또 팬의 자발성과 또 그 나라에서의 맥락에서 행동주의와 또 거기 개입하는 자본의 힘 같은 게 항상 이렇게 경합하는 거잖아요. 그래서 투명하지 않고 복잡하게 두 가지 힘이 항상 얽히고 이제 그것을 전유하려는 자본과 또 그런 힘들이 있을 것이고요. 그게 이제 결국은 정치성을 결정짓는 게 아닌가. 그러니까 단면만 보고 이제 그것이 그 행동주의든 팬덤의 정치성이라고 말하는 것은 조금 너무 쉬운 게 아닌가 하는 생각이 듭니다.
예, 통역은 마이크 좀 선호세요.
Okay, so starting from the beginning, so based on the story of the Squid Game, so it began as it was quite famous in relatively poor countries at the beginning, but as time goes by, it became really famous in U.S. as well. And after that, we can see the influx of U.S. capitalism coming into Korean Peninsula in terms of content. So we can see the clash between the narratives of the K content or K culture itself and the influence of capitalism or the capital itself. So I think it's quite difficult or almost impossible to dissect and see the clash between the K-pop culture or the K capitalism in a simplified way. I think we need more rather in-depth research or further studying to see what's involved or what's consisting such a dichotomy or the interrelations between the two.
예, 감사합니다. We have a question from Alam Hassan, and I think this is the last question. We don't have any time. Are you online? Can you turn? Hello.
Hi.
Hi. I had a question, but if you can just read it yourself. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, what?
I do have your question online, but if you can just read it in person.
Yeah, absolutely. I was wondering, and this question is for Professor CHEON, is there a difference in terms of the linguistic use that have been taken on by local Korean fandoms that has been like adopted or maybe even changed apart the linguistic use, such as like flex or wokeness, into either just the financial or political usage or just for pure entertainment? And was there a general cultural shift of those linguistic usages that have come from platforms such as Twitter?
Can I just ask you to clarify or add a little bit more about what you mean by linguistic usages?
Linguistic usages such as like informal colloquial use, like terms that have been popularly used by North American fans, K-pop fandoms, such as like flexing on people or like being woke in regards to George Floyd demonstrations. But then it has such a cultural shift here in the United States. Was there an actual shift within the Korean culture, or was that just something that is only used within the online platforms, if there are any data on that?
Yeah, okay, I think I understand. I don't have a lot of information about the specific question that you're asking, so I apologize for that. But I think I can answer your question by just saying a little bit about the relationship between Korean fandom and international fandom and where they're coming together. You know, I mean, I think that there is so on Twitter, for instance, because this is a platform that's used in many different places. It has certain differences. Obviously, people will post in various different languages, but there is also a kind of similar interface, and you can use hashtags to search for various topics. So the way that the fandom uses Twitter is to kind of include all of the potential hashtags that could bring people together. And I think that having this kind of platform has really changed the way that fandoms kind of overcome the barriers of language and customary expectations and that sort of thing, because international fandoms and Korean fandoms used to be very separate. And it was, in large part because the communication infrastructure was very different, like an international fan would have a very hard time participating in the fan cafes that were the primary place where fans convened and shared information. So now that there is a different platform that's being used, the role of translators is incredibly important, and there are translators within various fandoms that facilitate access for fans, whether or not they speak and read Korean or not. And I think there you see a lot more exchange, I think, between fans of different, cultural backgrounds. But on Twitter, the largest K-pop fan groups are North American. And so, again, as I was saying earlier, part of the problem is that, journalists and other media producers in North America tend to think that Twitter gives them access to the world's opinions and the world's discussions, where it's actually very narrow. And even within the United States, Twitter is the platform with the lowest number of users compared to Facebook and Instagram. So you're really looking at a very small slice of what people think, but the epistemological function of Twitter is quite different. It's outsized based compared to the actual usage. So I'm sorry that that's not a very complete answer to that question, but it's an important one, and it can only be answered by understanding the structure of relating between fan groups in different places. How do they get access to each other's views and that sort of thing?
Thank you. Thank you for the question.
Thank you for answering.
So we'll have to move to lunch. We only have 15 minutes actually, so we'll end here. I'd like to thank all of the speakers for the wonderful and thought-provoking presentations. Also, especially Professor Bang for joining us online. I'm sorry you couldn't be here. Okay, so thank you, Professor Bang. So please give a big applause for all the presenters here as well, and we'll move to lunch.